He didn't realize the moment his life started slipping past him, because nothing dramatic happened, no loud warning, no sudden collapse, just a quiet, almost invisible pattern repeating itself day after day, until one morning he paused for a second longer than usual and felt something he couldn't quite explain, a subtle discomfort, like standing in a room that looked familiar but no longer felt like home. And in that moment a thought crossed his mind so simple it almost felt stupid. What if nothing is actually stopping me? What if the only reason I haven't changed anything is because I've been waiting for a reason that doesn't exist? And the more he sat with that idea, the heavier it became, because it wasn't comforting. It wasn't inspiring in the way motivational speeches usually are. It was unsettling, because it meant that everything around him, the job he tolerated, the conversations he avoided, the dreams he quietly buried, were not accidents or bad luck, or circumstances beyond his control. They were choices, not loud, deliberate choices, but silent ones, made in the form of hesitation, inaction, and the quiet decision to stay the same. And that realization didn't empower him at first, it cornered him. Because if he was the one allowing it, then he was also the one responsible for it. And responsibility is heavy when you've spent so long convincing yourself that you had none. And he started replaying moments in his head, opportunities he didn't take, words he didn't say, paths he didn't explore, not because they were impossible, but because they were uncomfortable, uncertain, risky, and somewhere along the way, he had started to treat discomfort as a stop sign instead of a signal. He had learned to interpret fear as a reason to pause, rather than a reason to move. And without realizing it, he had built a life that felt stable on the surface, but hollow underneath. A life where everything made sense logically, but nothing felt alive emotionally. And that was the most dangerous part, because nothing was technically wrong, which made it easy to ignore, easy to justify, easy to postpone change for another day, and another, until days quietly became years, and he wondered how many people were doing the exact same thing, walking around convinced that something external needed to shift before they could, waiting for permission, waiting for clarity, waiting for the perfect moment, as if life was going to send them a formal invitation to begin. And the truth started to reveal itself slowly, not as a sudden breakthrough, but as a growing discomfort he could no longer ignore. That there is no invitation, no green light, no perfect timing. There is only the present moment and the quiet choice of what to do with it. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized how often he had outsourced his power, how often he had placed his life on hold because he didn't feel ready, didn't feel qualified, didn't feel certain. But certainty had never been the requirement. Action was, and yet he had reversed the order, waiting to feel something before doing something, when in reality, it was always the doing that created the feeling. And that inversion had kept him stuck, not trapped by reality, but by perception, by a story he had been telling himself for so long it felt like truth, that things were the way they were, and that was just how life worked. And for the first time, he questioned that narrative, not aggressively, not with rebellion, but with curiosity. What if life is more flexible than I thought? What if the boundaries I feel are not walls but habits, repeated thoughts that have hardened over time? And if that's true, then changing them wouldn't require force, just awareness and a willingness to act differently, even in small ways. And that idea was both freeing and terrifying, because it stripped away the comfort of excuses. It meant he couldn't blame timing or circumstances or other people anymore. It meant that the gap between where he was and where he wanted to be was not some mysterious force, but a series of small decisions he had avoided making. And suddenly, the problem wasn't abstract anymore. It was personal, immediate, real, and he could feel the resistance rise within him. That familiar voice that whispered, maybe later, maybe when things are clearer, maybe when you're more prepared. And for a long time he had listened to that voice without question, treated it like wisdom instead of what it really was, a defense mechanism trying to keep him safe. But safe had quietly become stagnant, and stagnant had slowly become unbearable. And in that tension between comfort and dissatisfaction, something shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to create a crack in the routine, a small opening where a different kind of thought could enter, one that didn't ask for certainty or permission. One that simply asked, what if you just did it anyway? What if you stopped negotiating with your fear and started moving despite it? What if the life you want isn't waiting for a reason, but for a decision? And that question didn't give him answers, it gave him responsibility. And responsibility forced him to look at his life, not as something happening to him, but as something being shaped by him, moment by moment, choice by choice, even in the smallest ways. And he began to see that change wasn't some distant event that required a complete overhaul. It was something that could begin instantly, in the way he responded to a thought, in the way he acted on an impulse, in the way he chose to either lean into discomfort or retreat from it. And the simplicity of that realization was almost frustrating, because it meant he had always had access to it. There was no secret, no hidden knowledge, just a willingness he hadn't yet embraced. And as he sat there, in that quiet space between what was and what could be, he understood something that would be impossible to unsee. That the biggest barrier in his life had never been ability or opportunity, but hesitation. The habit of waiting for a reason, instead of realizing he never needed one in the first place. And with that awareness came a subtle but undeniable shift. Not a complete transformation, not a sudden surge of confidence, but a quiet readiness, a sense that maybe, just maybe, the next step didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to be taken. And that thought lingered, not as pressure, but as possibility, opening the door to something he had been unknowingly standing in front of for far too long. The realization that his life would not change until he did, and that change would not begin with a reason, but with a decision he had been postponing up until now. It didn't happen all at once, that shift in the way he saw the world. It unfolded slowly, almost quietly, like a fog lifting just enough for him to notice shapes that had always been there. Patterns in people, in conversations, in routines that suddenly felt too predictable to ignore. And once he saw them, he couldn't unsee them. Because everywhere he looked, he began to notice the same contradiction playing out again and again. People speaking about what they wanted, while living in ways that guaranteed they would never get it. Complaining about situations they refused to leave. Dreaming about lives they never attempted to build. And at first, he judged them, silently, wondering how they could tolerate such a disconnect, how they could wake up every day and willingly step back into something that drained them. But that judgment didn't last long, because it didn't take much reflection for him to realize he was doing the exact same thing, just in ways that were easier to justify, more socially acceptable, less obvious on the surface. And that realization hit harder than anything else, because it removed the distance between him and the problem. It wasn't them anymore, it was him, it was everyone. It was a shared pattern of behavior rooted not in laziness or lack of intelligence, but in something far more subtle and powerful. Fear disguised as logic, hesitation disguised as patience, comfort disguised as stability. And once he began to look at it through that lens, everything started to make a different kind of sense. Because what looked like passivity was often just protection. What looked like indecision was often just avoidance. And what looked like acceptance was often just surrender in a more polite form. And he started to understand that people weren't trapped by their circumstances nearly as much as they were anchored by their interpretations of those circumstances, by the stories they told themselves about what was possible and what wasn't, about who they were and who they could become. And those stories weren't always loud or obvious. They didn't announce themselves as limitations. They whispered, they suggested, they nudged, saying things like, "This is just how life is. This is what people like you do. This is as good as it gets." And over time, those whispers accumulated, layered themselves into something that felt solid, something that felt real, something that didn't need to be questioned anymore. Because it had been repeated so many times, it became identity. And that was the most dangerous part. Because once a belief becomes identity, it stops being examined. It stops being challenged. It simply becomes the lens through which everything else is viewed. And he could see it clearly now. In the coworker who hated his job but stayed because it was secure. In the friend who talked about starting a business for years but never took the first step because it wasn't the right time. In the countless conversations where people spoke more about why they couldn't than about how they might. And it wasn't that their reasons were invalid. Many of them were real, practical, grounded in reality. But what struck him was how absolute those reasons had become. How they were treated not as obstacles to navigate, but as final verdicts. And he began to wonder how many of those limits were actually fixed and how many were simply untested. And that question alone started to shift something inside him, because it introduced uncertainty into what had once felt certain. And uncertainty, while uncomfortable, also created space for possibility, space for change, space for a different kind of response. And yet, even as he saw this more clearly, he could feel the resistance within himself, that same pull toward familiarity, that same urge to maintain the status quo, because recognizing a pattern doesn't automatically free you from it. If anything, it makes the tension more noticeable, because now you're aware of the gap between what you know and what you do. And that gap can be uncomfortable to sit with, because it forces you to confront a question that is both simple and difficult. If you see it, why aren't you changing it? And he didn't have a satisfying answer, not at first. Just fragments, excuses that sounded reasonable on the surface, but felt weaker the more he examined them. Things like, it's complicated, it's not the right moment, there are too many variables. And while those statements weren't entirely false, they were incomplete, because they ignored a deeper truth, that complexity and uncertainty are not exceptions to action. They are the conditions in which action always exists. There is no version of life where everything is perfectly aligned before you move. No scenario where all risk is removed and all doubt disappears. And yet, he had been waiting for exactly that, treating uncertainty as a signal to pause, rather than an inherent part of the process. And that misinterpretation had kept him in a loop, always preparing, always thinking, always analyzing, but rarely doing. And he started to see how easy it was to mistake motion for progress, to confuse planning with execution, to feel productive without actually moving forward. And that realization forced him to confront another uncomfortable truth, that sometimes the most significant changes are not blocked by external barriers, but by internal habits. Habits of thought, habits of avoidance, habits of choosing the familiar over the unknown, even when the familiar is unsatisfying. And those habits are not broken by insight alone. They require disruption. They require a decision to act differently, even when it feels unnatural, even when it feels premature, even when it feels like you don't have enough information. And that's where things become difficult, because acting in the absence of certainty goes against everything we've been conditioned to do. We're taught to be careful, to be strategic, to minimize risk. And while those principles have value, they can also become cages when applied too rigidly, because they create a false standard where action is only justified once all conditions are met. And since those conditions are rarely, if ever, fully met, action is continuously postponed. And he could see now how that pattern had played out in his own life. How many times he had stood at the edge of something new and stepped back, not because he couldn't move forward, but because he couldn't guarantee the outcome. And in doing so, he had unknowingly guaranteed something else, that nothing would change. And that realization carried weight, because it reframed inaction not as neutrality, but as a decision with consequences, a choice that shapes the trajectory of your life just as much as any bold move does. And once he understood that, the idea of staying the same no longer felt safe. It felt like a quiet form of loss, a gradual drifting away from the version of himself he could become. And that awareness didn't instantly transform him. It didn't eliminate fear or hesitation, but it changed the way he related to them. It made them visible. It made them questionable. And most importantly, it made them optional. Not in the sense that they would disappear, but in the sense that they didn't have to dictate his actions. And that distinction, subtle as it was, created a new kind of possibility. One where he could feel uncertain and still move, where he could acknowledge fear without obeying it, where he could begin to dismantle the invisible structures that had been shaping his life for so long. Not by force, not by sudden reinvention, but by small, deliberate shifts in how he responded to the moments in front of him. And as that understanding deepened, he found himself standing at a different kind of threshold, not one defined by external change, but by internal readiness, a quiet recognition that seeing the pattern was no longer enough, that awareness without action would simply become another form of stagnation, and that if he truly wanted something different, he would have to step beyond observation and into participation, even if that meant stepping into uncertainty, even if that meant leaving behind the comfort of explanations and moving into the discomfort of experience. Because at some point, understanding the cage is no longer the goal, leaving it is. And that realization lingered, steady and unresolved, pointing him toward a choice he could no longer ignore, a choice that would demand more than thought, more than reflection, a choice that would require him to confront something far more direct and far more final than anything he had considered so far. There was a moment not marked by anything extraordinary, no dramatic turning point or external shock, just a quiet, almost uncomfortable clarity that settled in when he least expected it, when the noise of the day faded just enough for a single thought to rise above everything else. A thought so simple and so obvious that it felt almost absurd he had managed to avoid it for so long. And yet, once it appeared, it refused to leave, lingering in the background of everything he did, subtly reshaping the way he looked at his life. Because it wasn't a motivational idea. It wasn't something designed to inspire or comfort. It was something far more direct, far more final. The realization that his time was not unlimited, that one day, whether he was ready or not, everything he knew, everything he planned, everything he postponed would come to an end. And while that truth had always existed somewhere in the abstract, it had never felt personal until now. It had never pressed against his decisions in a way that demanded a response. But now it did, and it changed the weight of everything, because suddenly the cost of hesitation became visible, not as a missed opportunity here or there, but as something cumulative, something that could define an entire life if left unchecked. And he began to see how easily time could be misunderstood, how it could feel abundant simply because it moved slowly in the moment, how days could feel long while years disappeared without warning. And he thought about the people who had reached the later stages of life, the ones who spoke not about the risks they took, but about the ones they didn't, the conversations they never had, the chances they let pass, the versions of themselves they never allowed to exist. And what struck him most was not regret in the dramatic sense, but a quieter kind, a subtle awareness of what could have been, a recognition that the boundaries they once believed in had not been as fixed as they seemed. And that insight began to settle into him in a way that was impossible to ignore, because it forced him to look at his own life, not just as it was, but as it could end up if he continued along the same path. And that projection was unsettling, not because it was catastrophic, but because it was predictable, because he could already see the pattern, already sense where it might lead. And the idea of reaching that point, of looking back and realizing that he had spent years waiting for the right moment instead of creating it, felt heavier than any immediate fear he had been using to justify his inaction. And that was the shift, the point where the fear of acting began to compete with the fear of not acting, where the discomfort of change was no longer the only factor in the equation, because now there was something else, something quieter but more persistent, the awareness that time would continue moving, regardless of what he chose to do. That inaction was not a pause, but a direction, a slow but steady commitment to a version of life that required no risk but offered no growth. And once he saw that, the idea of waiting lost its appeal. Because waiting for clarity, waiting for confidence, waiting for certainty, all started to look like different forms of the same thing: delay. And delay, when viewed through the lens of a finite life, began to feel less like caution and more like avoidance. And he started to question the assumptions he had been operating under, the belief that he needed to have everything figured out before taking a step, the idea that mistakes were something to be minimized at all costs, the notion that there was a correct path that could be identified in advance if only he thought about it long enough. And as he examined those beliefs more closely, he realized how fragile they were, how dependent they were on the illusion that the future could be controlled through preparation alone. And yet, every meaningful change he had ever witnessed, in himself or in others, had come not from perfect planning, but from imperfect action, from decisions made in uncertainty, from steps taken without guarantees. And that contradiction became impossible to ignore, because it suggested that the very thing he had been avoiding, uncertainty, was not a barrier to progress, but a condition of it, something that could not be eliminated but had to be engaged with. And that realization didn't remove his fear. It recontextualized it. It placed it within a larger framework where it was no longer a signal to stop, but a natural response to stepping into something new. And with that shift came a different kind of question. Not whether he was ready, not whether he had enough information, but whether he was willing to accept the cost of staying the same, whether he was willing to trade the discomfort of action for the long-term weight of inaction. And when framed that way, the answer began to change, not because action suddenly became easy, but because inaction no longer felt neutral. It felt like a choice with consequences he could already see unfolding, and he began to understand that the life he was living was not something that would suddenly transform on its own, that there would be no moment where everything aligned perfectly, and the path forward became obvious. That clarity was not something you waited for, but something that emerged through movement, through engagement, through the willingness to step forward without knowing exactly where the step would lead. And that understanding brought with it a quiet urgency, not a frantic rush to do everything at once, but a steady recognition that the present moment was not something to be spent passively, that each decision, no matter how small, was part of a larger pattern, a larger trajectory that would, over time, define the shape of his life, and that the longer he delayed, the more that trajectory would solidify, the harder it would become to shift, not because change was impossible, but because habits, once repeated enough times, begin to feel like identity, and identity is far more resistant to change than behavior alone. And so he found himself at a point where the abstract had become concrete, where the idea of time was no longer distant, but immediate, where the consequences of his choices were no longer theoretical, but tangible. And in that space, something within him began to recalibrate, not in a dramatic or visible way, but in a quieter, more fundamental sense. A shift in priorities, a shift in perspective, a shift in what he was willing to tolerate and what he was no longer willing to ignore. And while he didn't yet know exactly what he would do differently, he knew that continuing in the same way was no longer an option he could accept without question. Because now he had seen too clearly what that path could lead to. And once you see that, truly see it, it becomes impossible to return to the comfort of unawareness. Impossible to pretend that time is something you can afford to spend without intention. And that awareness, steady and unrelenting, carried him forward to a new edge, one where the question was no longer about understanding or reflection, but about action, about whether he would continue to observe his life from a distance or finally step into it fully, despite the uncertainty, despite the risk. Because for the first time, the cost of not doing so felt far greater than anything he feared on the other side. At first, it didn't feel like courage, it felt like resistance, like standing at the edge of something unfamiliar, while every instinct in his body urged him to step back, to return to what he knew, to choose what was predictable over what was possible. And for a long time, he had listened to that instinct without question, interpreting it as wisdom, as caution, as a sign that something wasn't right. But now, after everything he had begun to see, that interpretation no longer held the same authority, because he had started to notice a pattern, that the moments which carried the most discomfort were often the ones that pointed toward growth, and the moments that felt the safest were often the ones that kept him exactly where he was. And that realization created a kind of internal tension that was impossible to ignore, because it forced him to reconsider something he had always taken for granted, the idea that fear was something to avoid, something to move away from, when in reality, it might be something entirely different, something that marked the boundary between who he was and who he could become. And once that possibility entered his mind, fear itself began to look less like an obstacle and more like a signal, not a command to stop, but an invitation to pay attention, to look closer, to ask a different question. Not what if this goes wrong, but what if this is exactly where I need to go? And that shift, subtle as it was, began to change the way he approached the moments that used to paralyze him. Because instead of immediately retreating, he started to pause, to observe the reaction rather than obey it, to recognize that the surge of discomfort, the tightening in his chest, the flood of doubts in his mind, were not necessarily indicators of danger, but natural responses to stepping beyond the familiar. And the more he practiced that awareness, the more space he created between the feeling and the action. And in that space, something new became possible. Choice, the ability to respond differently, to move forward even when every part of him wanted to stay still. And it wasn't easy, not even close, because going against deeply ingrained patterns never is. And there were moments when the pull of comfort felt overwhelming, when the idea of returning to what was known seemed far more appealing than pushing into what was uncertain. But those moments no longer held the same finality they once did, because now he could see them for what they were, not truths, not conclusions, but impulses, temporary states that would pass if he didn't reinforce them with action. And that understanding gave him just enough leverage to begin doing something he had avoided for so long, taking small, deliberate steps into the unknown. Not dramatic leaps, not reckless decisions, but intentional movements that challenged the boundaries he had previously accepted without question. And with each step, something interesting began to happen. Not externally at first, but internally. The fear didn't disappear, but it changed. It lost some of its authority, some of its ability to dictate his behavior, because he was proving to himself, in real time, that he could feel it and still act. That discomfort did not have to equal paralysis, and that realization was powerful. Not because it eliminated uncertainty, but because it redefined his relationship with it. And as that relationship shifted, so did his perspective on the situations he encountered. Challenges that once seemed like threats began to look like opportunities, not in a naive or overly optimistic way, but in a practical sense, because each challenge represented a chance to respond differently, to break a pattern, to reinforce a new way of operating, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, those small shifts began to accumulate, creating a momentum that he hadn't experienced before, a sense that he was no longer just thinking about change, but actively participating in it. And that participation brought with it a different kind of confidence, not the loud, unquestioning certainty he had once believed he needed, but a quieter, more grounded belief in his ability to handle whatever came next. And that belief was built not on outcomes, but on experience, on the repeated act of stepping forward despite not knowing exactly how things would unfold. And as he continued to do this, he began to see another layer of the pattern he had been trapped in, the illusion of safety that had kept him in place for so long. Because what he had once considered safe, the routines, the predictability, the avoidance of risk, started to reveal a different side, one that was far less comforting than he had imagined. Because it became clear that staying the same carried its own risks, quieter ones, less visible, but no less real. The risk of stagnation, the risk of unfulfilled potential, the risk of looking back one day and realizing that he had traded possibility for predictability. And that trade, once seen clearly, was no longer as appealing as it once was, because it wasn't actually safety. It was a form of slow surrender, a gradual acceptance of less than what was possible. And that recognition shifted the balance once again, because now the question was no longer whether stepping into the unknown was risky, but whether staying where he was any less so. And when viewed through that lens, the idea of taking action began to feel less like a gamble and more like a necessity, not because it guaranteed success, but because it was the only path that allowed for growth. And that didn't mean every step would lead to the outcome he wanted. Far from it. There were missteps, moments of doubt, instances where things didn't go as planned. But even those experiences began to take on a different meaning, because instead of being seen as failures, they became part of the process, feedback rather than verdicts, information rather than judgment. And that shift reduced their power to discourage him, because they were no longer evidence that he shouldn't try, but proof that he was engaging with something real, something that required effort, adaptation, resilience. And through that engagement, he started to develop a deeper sense of trust in himself. Not in the sense that he would always succeed, but in the sense that he would continue to move, to adjust, to learn, regardless of the immediate outcome. And that trust became a stabilizing force, something he could rely on, even when external circumstances were uncertain. And it allowed him to push further, to take on challenges that he would have previously avoided, to lean into situations that once felt too intimidating to consider. And with each new experience, the boundary of what felt possible expanded. Not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily, consistently, in a way that was both subtle and profound. Because it wasn't just changing what he did, it was changing how he saw himself. From someone who avoided discomfort to someone who could navigate it. From someone who waited for the right conditions to someone who could create movement within imperfect ones. And that transformation, while still in progress, carried him to a point where the idea of retreating, of returning to the old patterns, no longer felt like a viable option. Not because it was impossible, but because it was now clearly a step backward, a return to a version of himself he had begun to outgrow. And standing there, in the midst of that ongoing shift, he could feel something building. Not a final conclusion, not a complete resolution, but a growing alignment between what he understood and how he acted. A sense that he was moving closer to something more authentic, more intentional, more fully engaged. And that movement, imperfect as it was, pointed him toward the next stage of his journey, one that would require him to go even deeper, to confront not just his actions, but the very identity he had been operating from, to uncover what had been dormant beneath the surface for so long, waiting, quietly, for the moment he was ready to face it. At some point, after all the questioning, all the tension, all the small steps into discomfort, he began to notice something that didn't announce itself loudly, but made its presence known in quieter, more persistent ways. A shift not just in what he was doing, but in how he was seeing himself. And it didn't come from a single decision or a dramatic breakthrough. It emerged gradually, built from the accumulation of moments where he chose to act instead of hesitate, to move instead of wait. And as those moments stacked on top of each other, they started to form a new kind of awareness, one that pointed inward rather than outward. Because for so long, he had been focused on changing his circumstances, adjusting his environment, trying to find the right external conditions to support the life he wanted. But now he was beginning to understand that the real transformation wasn't happening around him, it was happening within him, in the way he interpreted challenges, in the way he responded to uncertainty, in the way he defined his own limits. And that realization led him to something deeper, something he had sensed before but never fully confronted. The idea that there was a version of himself he had been holding back, not because it didn't exist, but because it didn't align with the expectations he had absorbed over time. The expectations of what was realistic, what was acceptable, what was safe. And those expectations had shaped his identity in subtle but powerful ways, guiding his decisions, influencing his behavior, narrowing his perception of what was possible. And for a long time, he had mistaken that constructed identity for his true self. He had believed that who he was fixed, defined by his past, by his experiences, by the roles he had taken on. But now, with everything he had begun to see and experience, that belief was starting to crack, because he could feel something else beneath it, something less rigid, less constrained, something that didn't fit neatly into the patterns he had been following. And the more he paid attention to it, the more real it became, not as a clear image or a fully formed idea, but as a presence, a quiet but persistent sense that there was more to him than what he had been expressing, more capability, more depth, more potential than he had allowed himself to explore. And that awareness brought with it a different kind of challenge, one that went beyond action and into identity, because it required him to question not just what he did, but who he believed himself to be. And that was not a simple process, because identity is not something we consciously choose in a single moment. It is something that develops over time, shaped by repetition, reinforced by experience, and protected by the mind because it provides a sense of stability. And challenging it can feel like destabilizing everything, like stepping into uncertainty on a deeper level, because it means letting go of familiar narratives, even if those narratives have been limiting. And that tension was something he had to face directly, the pull between the comfort of who he had been and the uncertainty of who he could become. And there were moments when the old identity tried to reassert itself, when the familiar thoughts returned, suggesting that maybe he was pushing too far, maybe he should scale it back, maybe he should return to what he knew. And those moments were not easy, because they didn't feel like resistance, they felt like reason, like caution, like a voice of experience trying to keep him grounded. But now he had enough awareness to question that voice, to recognize that it was not necessarily a reflection of truth, but a reflection of habit, a pattern that had been reinforced over time and was now being challenged. And instead of immediately accepting it, he began to observe it, to create space between the thought and his response, to ask whether it aligned with the direction he wanted to move in. And that process, repeated over time, began to weaken the hold of the old identity, not by force, but by lack of reinforcement. Because each time he chose differently, each time he acted in a way that contradicted the old narrative, he was effectively rewriting it, creating new evidence, new experiences that supported a different understanding of who he was. And that new understanding didn't arrive fully formed. It developed gradually, shaped by action, refined by reflection, and strengthened by consistency. And as it did, something else began to emerge alongside it, a sense of alignment, a feeling that his actions were no longer in conflict with his deeper instincts, that he was no longer holding himself back in the same way, and that alignment brought with it a different kind of energy, not the fleeting motivation that comes and goes, but a more stable, grounded sense of direction, a clarity that didn't depend on external validation or perfect conditions, but on an internal recognition of what mattered and a willingness to pursue it. And with that came a shift in how he approached his life as a whole. because he was no longer looking for permission, no longer waiting for confirmation that he was on the right path. He was creating the path through his actions, through his decisions, through his willingness to engage with the unknown. And that didn't mean everything became easy or predictable, far from it. There were still challenges, still moments of doubt, still situations that tested his resolve. But those moments no longer carried the same weight, because they were no longer interpreted as signs that he should stop, but as part of the process, as natural elements of a life that was being actively shaped rather than passively experienced. And that perspective allowed him to move forward with a different kind of resilience, one that was not dependent on avoiding difficulty, but on navigating it, learning from it, and continuing despite it. And as he continued along this path, he began to see how far he had come, not in terms of external achievements, but in terms of internal change, in the way he thought, in the way he responded, in the way he saw himself and his place in the world. And that recognition was both grounding and motivating, because it showed him that change was not only possible, it was already happening, already unfolding through the choices he was making each day. And it reinforced something he had come to understand more deeply than ever before, that the life he experienced was not something fixed or predetermined, but something fluid, something shaped continuously by his actions, his decisions, his willingness to step into the unknown and engage with what was in front of him. And that understanding carried him to a point where the question that had started everything, the question of whether he needed a reason to act, no longer held the same weight, because he had seen, through experience, that action itself was the reason, that waiting for something external to justify movement was unnecessary, because movement was what created change, what created clarity, what created the conditions he had once believed needed to exist beforehand. And standing there, in that awareness, he could feel a quiet but undeniable shift in how he related to his life. No longer as something to be managed or endured, but as something to be lived, actively, intentionally, without waiting for permission, without needing certainty, without requiring a perfect explanation. And in that shift, something that had once felt distant and abstract became immediate and real. The understanding that everything he had been searching for externally had always been accessible internally, not as a fixed answer, but as a capacity, a potential that could be expressed through action, through choice, through the willingness to step forward even when the path was not fully visible. And with that realization, the hesitation that had once defined him lost its foundation, because it no longer had the same justification, no longer held the same authority, and while it might still appear from time to time, it was no longer something that could dictate his direction, because he had experienced something stronger, something more reliable, the knowledge that he could act without a perfect reason, that he could move without complete certainty, that he could shape his life through the decisions he made in each moment. And that knowledge, grounded in experience rather than theory, became the foundation for everything that followed, carrying him forward not with the illusion of control, but with the confidence of participation, a willingness to engage fully with whatever came next, knowing that the path would not be revealed in advance, but created as he walked it.